was full and high up in the sky when Josh came out of the tent with his bottle of scotch. He had been hiking all day at Skinwalker Peak, and now he could finally rest. He looked at the view, and far away he saw the sparkling lights of Dreadford in the distance. The sound of crickets filled the mountain, and he felt at home. He reached in his jacket and took out a pack of cigarettes and lit one up, sitting in a camping chair. The cold air filled his nostrils, and the mix of alcohol and tobacco made him more relaxed. Monday he would have to go back to his minimum wage job as a barista, but tonight he was a free man. He thought about Carla. She was a client at his coffee place, and they have been flirting for a while, and yesterday by chance he bumped into her outside his work. He built up his nerve and asked her out, and she accepted. They would go to the movies and see where the night would go from there. The thought of the date made him smile, but he never noticed. Suddenly the place became very quiet, and a chill ran up his spine. He looked one way and another, and in the bushes, drowned in shadows right where the camplight could not reach, he saw what seemed to be a figure looking at him. He got up and took a step forward, but there was nothing. He asked if someone was there but heard no answer. He stood in place for a while until he convinced himself it was his mind playing tricks. He took another sip of whiskey and lit up another cigarette. When he lifted his head, he saw again, right in front of him, standing still in the darkness. He could feel the eyes of the figure on him. He asked whoever it was to make itself known, but the figure gave a step behind the trees and vanished. Josh thought he was seeing things. He looked at the glass of whiskey and threw the remainder of the glass on the floor. He walked around camp for a while, but did not find anyone. He checked his .38 just to make sure, but decided it was his mind playing tricks. Skinwalker Peak was known for eerie and bizarre occurrences. Glowing orbs, Bigfoot, skinwalkers, feral people were part of the mythology of these mountains, but Josh never took it seriously. Finally, he gave up and went to his tent to try to get some sleep. The next day, he packed all his gear and continued his hike. As he went through the trail, the hair on his neck raised and a feeling of dread and impending doom started to flood his mind. He stopped and checked his surroundings, but even though no animal or person was visible, he could not shake the feeling off. He continued his path, trying to be as much aware as he could, but that feeling never left. He stopped to rest for a bit, drink water and eat. As he was munching on a protein bar, he heard the snap of a twig outside the trail. He looked around, and he could swear he was seeing a dark figure between branches some 30 feet from him. He brushed his eyes and looked again, but no one was there, and the hair on his arm raised. He tried once again to brush it off, made camp, but decided this night he would spend it inside his tent. He checked his map, calculated how far he was from his destination, and went to sleep. He was awoken by steps on his camp. Crippling fear took hold of him, and he stood still under his covers. The steps continued and stopped right next to his tent, and whoever it was stood there gazing upon it for a while. He trembled, and it was with great effort that he held his breath, and when he could not hold it any longer, he tried as quiet as possible to breathe by his mouth. Finally, whoever it was went away. He stood there for a bit, and then came out terrified. He looked at the ground, and there were no footprints nor anyone. He felt he was spiraling. Was he going mad? Seeing things? He went back to his tent and tried to make himself sleep, but could not. When it was almost morning, he felt the smell of cigar invading his tent. That was it. He broke camp and returned to the trail. He was still one night away from his destination and decided to leave earlier. He spent another day feeling that he was being watched. Many times he thought he was seeing a figure outside the trail, but he had enough. He decided to ignore it and just finish the trail as quickly as he could, but now he was carrying his .38 by the waist in any case. The final night was here. Josh did not make fire this time. He didn't want his camp to be visible from afar, and he wanted to break camp as fast as he could the next day. He went to bed early and spent his time inside at all times. The feeling of being watched went away, and he finally fell asleep. At the witch's hour, he was awakened by what he thought was a bear sniffing around his camp. Although the size was right, the shadows projected in the sides of the tent revealed more wolf-like features on the creature's head. Josh was puzzled and frightened at the same time. He reached for his .38 and cocked it. The creature heard and stopped immediately what it was doing, and in an immense display of cunning, slowly walked away from camp. But when Josh could finally rest again, he heard it. A howl cut the silence of the night. Horrified, he started to gather his things as quickly as possible. He was breaking camp when he heard snarls and paws trampling the dirt. He collected only the necessary things leaving his tent and his boots behind, and started to run downhill bare feet as fast as he could. The only thing he carried was his .38. He heard barking and ran even faster, but stumbled, rolling down. His head was grazed and he stood up looking behind. He saw a mountain of fur and muscles coming after him, snarling. He took his gun and shot the creature 3 times. The animal was deterred enough for him to start to run again as fast as he could. He fled in darkness, barely seeing what was in front of him as the beast was constantly nearing. He could feel a warm breath in his neck. He screamed and ran, his legs burning beneath his weight. The beast was ever so close, but never catching him. He looked behind and saw the jaws of the animal reaching for his flesh. He jumped, barely escaping. When he landed, one of his feet stepped wrong and he fell. It was broken. He cried in pain, wincing. He shot everything that remained in the gun, but nothing could deter the beast this time. His vision was blurry and fading because of the pain and desperation, but when he could see again, there was only the red gleaming eyes of the creature before his jaw opened and bit him, and everything went dark. The next day, he was woken up by 2 hikers who found him. The sun shone brightly in his eyes, obfuscating his vision. He felt his skin covered in sweat and some blood, but his foot was healed. Did he hallucinate everything? The hikers told him not to worry. They had sent word to the park rangers. He was tired and still scared, but felt safe and allowed himself to collapse. The sun flooded the room of the hospital like a warm blanket on a cold day. Josh slowly woke up, feeling lost and disoriented.
Where am I?
You are in Dreadford's General Hospital, sir. You suffered an accident while hiking.
A feminine voice answered promptly. Josh turned toward the voice and saw a nurse standing beside his bed. She checked his temperature with a soft touch to his forehead using the back of her hand.
Accident?
Yes. You were very lucky. 2 other hikers found you and called for the park ranger's assistance. You could have died of hypothermia up in the mountains if it was not for them.
Josh's memories surged back, a chilling flash of red gleaming eyes piercing through the darkness.
It was no accident. I was being chased by some animal.
Bigfoot, maybe? It might have been hallucinations from hypothermia. I know they can look and sound very real, but you are safe now.
But it bit me in the...
Josh stopped mid-sentence in complete disbelief. He raised his arm, but it was unscathed, not a scratch. The nurse smiled.
Don't worry, just rest for now. The doctor will check up on you in a minute, but by the looks of it, you will get to go home very soon.
Josh scratched his head and glanced around the impeccably tidy room. As he checked for his wounds, each touch triggered a vivid flashback of the chase, the terror of being hunted, of being mere prey to some unflinching predator. Yet, to his astonishment, there were no bruises, no pain, nothing. He was completely healed, as if nothing had really happened. Confusion seized his thoughts. Maybe the nurse was right. Perhaps he had just drunk too much and fallen. That afternoon, after being discharged by the doctor, Josh went to the coffee shop where he worked, the Foxhole. The rich, earthy aroma of coffee beans immediately invaded his nostrils. But now the scents were sharper and more vibrant. He could distinctly identify each type: Colombian roast, Arabic roast, macadamia flavored. It felt odd, but perhaps his brush with death had sharpened his senses. He made his way to the counter and found Roxy.
Hey there, stranger. Shouldn't you be working today?
Hey, Roxy. Yeah, about that. I had an accident in the mountains while hiking. I was just discharged from the hospital. I'm really sorry. I'll make it up to you.
For real? Are you okay?
I'm fine. They just held me for observation, but I'm okay.
That's good. But I already rearranged the whole schedule for the week because of your absence, Josh. I'm sorry, but I had to cut your hours.
That hurt more than the accident.
It was an emergency, Roxy. It won't happen again, I promise.
She looked at him with a twinkle in her eye.
You're lucky, handsome, because you know the owner and never took a sick day. Otherwise, I would have to fire you.
Come on, you would never have the courage.
Oh, I would. You don't get into the coffee business to make friends.
Yeah, I know. It's a very cutthroat business. Be careful.
She laughed.
Okay, mister. You take the rest of the day off and settle your business. You come in tomorrow at 5 a.m., first shift.
You gonna make me open?
Oh, yes, and I'll take the day off. Consider yourself lucky.
All right.
Josh, one more thing. Carla came here looking for you, said you stood her up on a date. I suggest you find a way to make it up to her as well.
I'll figure something out.
Josh made his way to the Dreadford Chronicle, the city newspaper, where Carla worked as a journalist. In the lobby, he approached the attendant and asked to speak with her. The woman made a call and asked him to wait in the lounge area. Moments later, he saw Carla coming out of the elevator. He rushed over, his expression filled with remorse.
Carla, I'm really sorry to standing you up.
Don't worry, I know what happened. I'm just glad you are okay.
She hugged him.
How do you know?
I would not be a very good journalist if I didn't, right? I received a notice about the park ranger's rescue, so I went to Dreadford's General to cover it, and lo and behold, it's you. We had an awfully good first date. You are a very good listener, but very quiet.
They chuckled.
I'm really sorry. I'll make it up to you.
You better. I am not one to be stood up on a date and handle second chances.
Dinner and a movie?
Sure, I get off work at 5.
It's a date.
It is.
He left the building and made his way back to his apartment. As he climbed the stairs and turned into the corridor, he bumped into Mr. Laszlo, the landlord.
Josh! I wanted to speak with you. You disappeared and the rent is due. When are you paying me my money?
Sorry, Mr. Laszlo. I lost a few hours this week at the coffee shop, but I am sure I can give you the money by Friday. How does that sound?
Sounds late. You better have my money by Friday, or I'm gonna dump your stuff in the street and kick you out of here.
Deal, sir. Deal. I'll have the rent by Friday, thanks.
He left for his apartment, under the suspicious gaze of Mr. Laszlo. The place was a mess, but he did not bother, and went straight to bed. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, his muscles aching as if they had been pushed beyond their limits after a long period of inactivity. As soon as he lay down, sleep overtook him, pulling him into a deep, immediate slumber. In his dreams, he found himself amid a haunting landscape. Wolves howled at the moon, their cries echoed through the night as they raced across moonlit fields. Red eyes glimmered ominously in the darkness. The cold winter wind stung his skin as the wolves circled him in the snow, spiraling his vision into a nightmare. He saw ghosts. Their mournful cries filled the air as they reached out with their decrepit hands pleading for help. When he recoiled in terror, the ghosts turned into dark wraiths, their faces contorted with frustration and howling in anger, offended by his refusal to help. He saw demons laughing and pointing, their scorn directed at him. He felt the heat of profane fire and malevolence suffocating his being. The demons and ghosts chased him. Josh felt a heavy and sluggish weight dragging him down. He stumbled and struggled to run, feeling very afraid. He looked at his feet. He was horrified when he realized they had transformed into a wolf's paws. He felt a shiver. He wanted to turn back, but he could not do it. Around him, the specters and demons were ever so close. He tried to scream, but only a howl escaped his lips. Suddenly, a towering silhouette appeared before him. A huge creature, a battle beast with both wolf and man features, standing 9 feet tall. Its gaze was piercing and judgmental. Josh whimpered and shuffled forward, only to be met with the beast's thunderous howl and a searing bite. The pain jolted him awake, his own howl cutting through the darkness of his room. His heart was racing and his vision did not see color, only shades of gray. He walked, and the sound of the nails of his paws followed him through the apartment. He went to a mirror and realized he had turned into a wolf. He felt trapped and overwhelmed. Josh began to walk in circles inside the apartment, barking in panic. In his head, he felt like he was still dreaming. He whimpered and darted to the door. But his paws, still in their wolf form, fumbled helplessly with the handle. He began to scratch the door in frustration, growling and barking, although not as loud as a dog. Mr. Laszlo was smoking a cigarette in his kitchen while drinking old and stale coffee when the piercing sound of frantic scratching and barking erupted from the corridor. His brow furrowed in irritation as he set down his coffee and stubbed out his cigarette. Annoyed, he stormed out of his apartment and followed the ruckus. It didn't take long for him to realize the noise was coming from Josh's apartment.
Josh! God damn it! How many times have I told you? You cannot have animals in the building.
He banged on the door, but there was no response, only the furious scratching of the animal.
This goddamn dog is gonna ruin my door!
He finally gave up and, frustrated, took off his keychain filled with numerous keys and unlocked the door. To his surprise, when he swung it open, a huge wolf burst out running past him. His heart jumped and almost gave up at the sight of the huge animal charging downstairs in a primal urgency. On the street, Josh ran and ran, but soon he realized he was drawing attention thanks to his huge size. He veered into empty back alleys in an attempt to go on unnoticed. The confusion gnawed at him. Was he cursed? Dreaming? Would he ever go back to his human shape? What could he do to change his predicament? He stopped in an abandoned alley, where in a wall stood a cracked mirror. He looked at himself. His eyes were yellow and his fur was black with red locks that started on the top of his head, passed through his back, and went to the end of his tail. He laid on the floor looking at himself and whimpered.
"Cry won't help, kid."
He heard coming from beside him. He looked up and saw a grey, translucent form of an old man, wearing an old cowboy attire, hovering above the ground. He had a melancholic look in his eyes. Josh jumped up to his paws and took a couple of steps back.
Don't worry. I don't mean any harm.
What is going on with me? I turned into a wolf and now I am seeing ghosts.
You were cursed under the full moon, kid. And this is just the beginning.
You can understand me?
Of course. The dead can understand anyone.
What do you mean I was cursed?
You have been recruited to their war. Everything will change for you now. Your life will never be the same.
Whose war?
You will find out soon enough.
And with that, he disappeared.
Wait, can I turn back?
Eventually, you will learn.
A man came out of the back of a bar into the alley and saw the black and red wolf barking to the empty space. He quickly went back and decided to stop drinking for good.
Learn?
None of this felt real. It was too out of this world and it didn't make any sense. He noticed it was already night and he rushed to the restaurant where he and Carla were supposed to meet. Hidden in the shadows of an alley, he spotted her waiting at the front door. She checked her watch, her face a mix of hope and disappointment. Josh whimpered softly. After a while, she sighed and walked away. He followed her from a distance, slipping through alleys to avoid drawing attention. But every once in a while, someone would notice him and point him out. He rushed to keep her in sight. At times, he would lose her, but would catch her scent in the air and find his path again. Instead of going home, she went to the Dreadford Chronicle building. She hoped to immerse herself in work rather than wallow in disappointment over a pot of ice cream. The building was downtown, and to reach it faster, she decided to cut through an alley and save some time. The narrow passage was dark and empty. Only the sound of steam hissing in contrast with the cold air could be heard. She moved faster, looking in all directions to make sure she was safe. But when she turned forward, 3 men blocked her passage.
"Hey, lady, you think I can borrow a couple of bucks?"
She took a couple of steps back and bumped into a 4th man who had a sinister smile. Terrified, she didn't answer.
Don't be rude, he asked you a question.
I don't.
Don't lie.
If you won't lend us, I think we are just gonna have to take it. Right, boys?
The first one said, pulling out a switchblade, getting ever close to her.
You are a very pretty lady. It would be a shame if I had to carve your face just to make a few dollars.
The sharp edge of the knife slowly reached for her cheeks. She closed her eyes, tears striking her face as she tried to recoil from the blade. Suddenly, the arm holding the knife was bitten by a mass of black fur, sharp teeth gnawing until the blade dropped to the floor. The man's scream mingled with the guttural growls of the beast. It snarled and bit down harder, forcing the man to the ground until he collapsed, writhing in pain. The other men stood frozen in shock, unable to believe their eyes. A black wolf attacking in the heart of the city. As the wolf turned to them, snarling with fury, their paralysis broke. They scattered in all directions, fleeing for their lives as the wolf howled in triumph. Carla remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed like a deer in headlights, staring at the wild animal. The wolf, in turn, made a soft, encouraging sound, urging her to move. She cautiously edged along, her eyes never leaving those piercing yellow orbs that tracked her every step. Only when she reached the safety of the newspaper building did she dare to look away.
Help!
The man on the floor pleaded, but the wolf growled and snorted, leaving him behind. He felt pretty bad for not showing up for his date with Carla again, but knowing he had helped her in a dangerous situation offered some solace. Unable to go back to his apartment, He walked along the empty streets at night and eventually he reached Veterans Park. There, he curled up inside some bushes and fell into a dreamless sleep. When he awoke, he found himself naked. A homeless man, noticing his plight, offered him some clothes. Josh accepted gratefully, surprised by the unexpected kindness. Perhaps there was still some good left in Dreadford after all.
You're gonna die like that in the cold, man. Take it. You need more than me.
Josh sprinted through the darkened streets of Dreadford as fast as he could, his heart pounding madly in his chest. Memories of his wolf vision flashed through his mind. Howling winds, sharp instincts, raw power. He pushed harder, willing his legs to move faster, to recapture the speed that had coursed through him the night before. But no matter how much effort he exerted, his human form betrayed him, feeling sluggish, heavy, like he was trapped in some feeble mockery of his true body. The frustration gnawed at him, a desperate yearning to shed his skin and run wild once again. He skidded to a stop in front of his apartment, breath ragged, the weight of humanity still clinging to him. Fumbling with his keys, he rushed inside, stripping away his sweat-soaked clothes and dove into the shower. The hot water cascaded over him, washing away the grime, but not the restless energy thrumming beneath his skin. Clean and dressed, Josh barely registered the cab ride to the foxhole. His mind kept drifting back to the thrill of the night before, the primal power he'd tasted. Even as he sat in the back seat, he couldn't shake the sense of loss, the aching need to feel that freedom again. He arrived late. The sign in the front door showed the place was already open. With a muttered curse, he hurried inside, grabbed his uniform from the back and slipped it on. But before he could reach the counter, Roxy stepped out of the shadows, arms crossed, her sharp gaze scanning him from head to toe.
The place is empty. You can catch your breath now.
How did you...
Carl called me. He came for his regular order and the place was still closed.
Josh ran a hand through his hair.
I'm sorry, Roxy. I don't know what's happening to me. If I told you, you wouldn't believe it.
Why don't you try me?
He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of the truth sat heavy on his tongue, impossible to speak. Josh swallowed hard, glancing away.
Look, I get it if you want to fire me.
He pulled off his apron, draping it over the prep table with a resigned sigh. Roxy watched him in silence, the corners of her mouth twitching in a hint of a smile, eyes sparkling with something just out of reach. She stood there for a long moment, studying him as if seeing something beyond the exhausted young man in front of her.
No, mister, you promised me a day off and I'm taking it, but I can't keep giving you second chances, Josh. This is a business.
I understand, Roxy.
Good luck, then.
She untied her apron and tossed it onto the counter, her gaze still sharp as a knife.
You are opening tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp. You better be here or Carl will let me know. This is your last chance, mister.
I'll be here.
You better.
She untied her apron and tossed it onto the counter, her gaze still sharp as a knife. With that, Roxy turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Josh standing alone in the back room of the coffee shop. The silence that followed was deafening, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. The usual customers filtered in and out, their chatter blending into the hum of the espresso machine. Josh plastered on his best customer service smile. He took orders and delivered drinks with robotic efficiency. For a few brief hours, he managed to bury the gnawing anxiety and pretend that everything was fine, that he was just another guy working a normal shift. By 1:30 p.m., it was finally over. He clocked out and stepped outside, but as soon as he put his first foot on the street, he heard a familiar voice call out,
Josh!
He froze, heart skipping a beat. Carla stood across the street, arms crossed, wearing her signature gotcha expression.
Carla, I'm really sorry for yesterday.
You stood me up again.
I was sick. Really sick. I think I had a high fever because I started hallucinating in bed.
Carla's eyes narrowed, the gears in her investigative mind turning. She had a sixth sense for spotting lies, and Josh knew he was treading on thin ice.
I swear, I thought I was a wolf or something and ran around town. It was crazy. I thought I was losing it.
That threw her off her game.
That's weird. I am pretty sure a wolf saved me from a group of thugs yesterday.
Josh blinked, and despite everything, a slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth.
Maybe it was a big dog? We don't have wolves in the city.
Maybe. Listen, I'm going to grab some coffee and head back to the Chronicle. Think you can walk me there? The streets of Dreadford aren't exactly safe these days.
Of course, come on. Coffee's on me.
They walked back inside, and as they waited for their drinks, Carla recounted her run-in with the thugs. Josh listened intently, hanging on her every word, captivated by the way she retold the story with a mix of humor and suspense. As they sipped their coffee, she asked about his fever and whether he was feeling better. He smiled, and when she returned the smile, he realized that despite everything, he really did feel better. After finishing their coffee, they headed down the streets toward the Dreadford Chronicle. The walk was uneventful, but there was a comforting ease between them. When they reached the newspaper's entrance, Carla leaned in and kissed him lightly on the cheek.
You still owe me dinner.
He smiled, watching her disappear inside before turning to make his way home. The streets were as grimy as ever, the city's usual filth and grit inescapable, but it was a nice, sunny day. He was relieved to have patched things up with both Roxy and Carla, but there was a lingering sense that he wasn't out of the woods yet. Still, the nightmare felt like it was fading. No more wolf visions, no ghosts haunting his steps. Maybe it really had all been a fever dream.
Josh!
A booming voice cut through his thoughts, followed by the sharp honk of a horn. He turned to see Carl in his white truck, waving from the driver's seat. The truck bed was filled with concrete finishing tools, and Carl himself was covered in a fine layer of grey dust. The man was built like a tank, with the rough, no-nonsense look of an ex-military guy who made his living pouring concrete at dawn. He, as usual, was wearing a baseball cap.
Hey, Carl!
Where are you going? Need a lift?
Josh sighed.
Sure.
He climbed into the truck, country music playing on the radio.
You snitched on me today.
Did I? Well, I need my coffee in the morning, buddy. Maybe you should wake up earlier. If I can, why can't you?
I had some strange problems.
Did you now? We all do. You are young, Josh. Change at your age is natural. You're a man.
It doesn't feel like it.
Carl laughed.
It never does. But let me give you a piece of advice, young one. Life changes all the time, and time moves forward, not backward. Embrace change, because you can't control life nor the world. There's only one thing you can control. Do you know what that is?
What's that?
Yourself. You can control yourself. So don't waste time trying to control what you can't. Spend your time learning to control yourself. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
I mean it, Josh. You can control yourself. Learn that and you'll go farther than most.
Josh studied the older man for a moment, wondering what Carl really meant. There was a depth to his words, something beyond the surface. Carl's laughter echoed through the truck, pulling Josh back to reality.
And if Roxy puts your ass on the street, come find me. I can teach you how to work concrete. It's hard work, but good money. And if you work hard one day, you can even make a business out of it.
They pulled up in front of Josh's building. Carl slowed the truck to a stop, giving him a nod.
There you are.
Thanks, Carl.
Josh got out of the truck and headed to the entrance when he heard Carl calling for him. He turned back and the big man had a grin.
Learn to control yourself. You can do it.
Carl drove off, leaving Josh with the echo of those words hanging in the air. As he entered the building, he nearly collided with Mr. Laszlo, the landlord. The old man's eyes narrowed immediately.
Where's my money, Josh?
Friday, remember?
What about that dog you had?
Got rid of it. I'll pay for the door.
You better or I'll...
Before he could finish, Josh turned on him, grabbing the landlord's bathrobe with surprising strength. Mr. Laszlo staggered, eyes wide with shock as Josh held him in place.
I had a tough night and a tough day, Mr. Laszlo. I'll have the money by Friday as promised.
Of course, of course.
Mr. Laszlo nodded quickly, his usual bravado replaced with a jumpy manner. Realizing what he'd done, Josh released his grip, smoothing out the man's robe in an awkward attempt to apologize.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have...
Mr. Laszlo took a step back, putting some distance between them.
Don't worry about it. You are a good kid, Josh. You just need to control that temper, or one day it will bite back at you.
There it was again, control. That same word, twice in one day. That word was beginning to follow him like a shadow. Josh muttered a quick goodbye and made his way up to his apartment. Once inside, he busied himself with his daily chores. He cleaned the place, did his laundry, and tried to settle into a routine. But when he opened the fridge to fix a meal, it was empty. Of course. With a sigh, he took a quick shower, changed into fresh clothes, and headed back out. The mini-mart down the street was his next stop. Saeed was at the counter when Josh entered the mini-mart. His face lit up with a warm smile. He was an Iraqi immigrant trying to live his dream of running a small business.
How are you doing, my boy? It's been a while.
Hey, Saeed. Yeah, it's been a tough week.
Then be glad it is not tougher.
Saeed chuckled and Josh laughed along, feeling a bit lighter.
Listen, most people think that life is hard and they complain, asking for life to be easier, but it's a mistake, you know?
Oh yeah, how's that?
You should never ask life to be easier, because life can't be easier. Life is life, you know? But you can always be stronger, so always ask to be stronger.
Josh reflected on his words, nodding slowly.
You're right.
There he is. Go on, go on. There is some milk in the back that's about to expire. If you take it, I'll give you a discount. What do you think?
Josh headed to the back and started to pick up his groceries. This week took a toll on him, but Saeed was right. He needed to be stronger. As he picked up the milk and checked the expiration date, he heard raised voices at the front. He slowly made his way through the small aisle towards the commotion. 3 men in sharp Italian suits were arguing with Saeed, who had his hands raised in a pleading gesture.
What do you mean you don't have the money?
Business is slow, I tell you. I want to pay, but I don't have it right now.
Without warning, one of the men slammed a display off the counter, sending it crashing to the floor. Another revealed a baseball bat and swung it at the merchandise on the counter.
Hey!
Josh shouted, stepping forward instinctively. Saeed shot him a desperate look, silently pleading with him not to get involved.
Why don't you go back to your shopping, boy, before you get hurt?
That same temper that had flared with Mr. Laszlo earlier began to rise again inside Josh, but this time it was burning hotter.
Why don't you leave before you do?
We've got ourselves a hero, huh? Haven't you heard, kid? No one likes a hero.
The man pulled out a knife from inside his suit. As the 3 men advanced, Josh instinctively backed into the aisle, moving out of Saeed's line of sight.
I'm not gonna lie, kiddo. This is gonna leave a mark.
The man with the bat said, swinging high. The bat collided with the overhead light, shattering it and plunging the aisle into darkness. The next swing came down hard on Josh's arm, followed by a flurry of punches from the man with the brass knuckles. The 3rd man stood back, playing with his knife, savoring the violence. Josh's rage was boiling over, transforming into something primal. His skin toughened, his jaw extended, and small tusks protruded from his mouth. His hair thickened and his body grew larger. When the bat came down again, it snapped in 2 against his arm. Josh stood up, his face now feral with gleaming yellow eyes. The 3 men recoiled in shock, but before they could flee, Josh grabbed one of them and hurled him into the ceiling. The criminal crashed down, barely conscious and groaning in pain. The man with the brass knuckles landed another punch, but it was useless against Josh's now inhuman strength. Josh grabbed him by the collar, headbutting him before delivering a series of brutal punches. The last man, holding the knife, watched in horror. He lunged forward, stabbing Josh in the side, but the wound closed almost instantly, healing right before his eyes. The man's expression twisted with fear as Josh grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground effortlessly.
If I see you here again, I'm gonna leave a mark on you and it will hurt.
He dropped the man, who scrambled to his feet and hurried out, dragging his associates with him. As Josh calmed, his body slowly returned to its human form. He stepped out of the aisle, and Saeed cautiously emerged from behind the counter, checking to see if the coast was clear.
I'm sorry for the mess, Saeed. I'll pay for...
Don't worry, it's okay.
At least let me pay for my groceries.
No, my boy. You take them. My gift to you. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Saeed. I don't know what came over me.
As he turned to leave, Saeed called after him.
You should control that temper, my boy.
There it was again. Control. St. Croix sat in the grand hall of Spectre's secret headquarters, deep in the labyrinthine sewers of Dreadford. The air was damp and heavy, the faint stench of decay mingling with the metallic tang of the surrounding environment. Spectre stood at the head of the chamber, his imposing frame encased in a sleek black tactical suit. His visor glowed faintly, hiding his features, while his voice modulator distorted his speech into a chilling, otherworldly resonance.
I trust you, St. Croix. You will not fall to threats or temptation. Half of Don Vittorio's domain is yours. Caroline has ensured our claim, but Saul is ambitious, and he has the other half. He will test your resolve.
St. Croix offered a respectful nod, though his mind churned with thoughts of the storm ahead. The late Don Vittorio's territory was a maze of criminal enterprises, ports, smuggling rings, and gambling dens. It was a crown jewel of Dreadford's underworld, but with it came a mantle of blood and danger. Spectre's visor tilted slightly, the faint glow intensifying as if to pierce through St. Croix's thoughts.
You have the strength to hold it. Remember that. Do not let Saul's hounds unsettle you.
St. Croix straightened, his expression stoic. Spectre's words carried a weight that was both empowering and ominous. The Duke of House Orlok did not give trust lightly. To falter would mean more than failure. It would mean oblivion. Later that night, St. Croix worked in the forge beneath his building, the Iron Den. The place was more than just a front. It was a sanctuary where he could clear his mind. The forge's heat was a comforting constant, its roar drowning out the cacophony of Dreadford's streets above. He gripped a glowing iron rod with a pair of tongs, the white-hot metal reflecting the intensity of his focus. The forge was where he honed weapons, reinforced his estate's defenses, and, on occasion, settled debts in ways others found distasteful. Tonight, however, the work was for his own clarity, the rhythmic pounding of hammer on metal easing the weight of Spectre's trust. The door creaked open, and a tall figure ducked under the threshold. The intruder's steps were confident, too casual for someone entering uninvited. St. Croix didn't look up as the vampire approached, his senses immediately recognizing the predator before him.
St. Croix, you've been awarded quite the prize,
the stranger said, his voice smooth yet heavy with veiled menace. St. Croix glanced up, his cold grey eyes meeting those of the envoy. The vampire was broad-shouldered and dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his presence commanding but unctuous.
Saul sends his regards. He'd like to see a peaceful resolution to this unfortunate division of Vittorio's domain.
And by peaceful, I assume you mean surrender,
St. Croix said, his tone flat as he returned to shaping the metal. The envoy chuckled, an edge of mockery in his voice.
No one said surrender. Think of it as cooperation. You keep a piece, of course, a generous piece, but the lion's share should go to Saul. He's better suited to manage the whole operation. It's what Vittorio would have wanted.
Vittorio is destroyed,
St. Croix replied, placing the glowing rod back into the forge. The envoy's smile thinned.
True. And you will be too if you don't see reason.
St. Croix turned to face him fully, his tall frame imposing in the forge's flickering light. The envoy's expression darkened, his tone shifting from persuasive to predatory.
Do you know what Saul does to those who stand in his way? He tears them apart piece by piece. Their businesses, their allies, their very existence gone. I'll start with your machine shop. Burn it to the ground, your thralls. They'll beg for death before I'm through with them. And you? I'll make you watch it all before I bury you under the ashes.
There are some things in life you should never say you will do. You just do it.
The forge hissed as St. Croix lifted the white-hot rod of metal from its flames. For a moment, the room was silent save for the crackle of fire. The envoy stepped back, finally sensing the shift in the air, but it was too late. With a swift, brutal motion, he swung the rod across the envoy's face. The glowing iron seared through flesh and bone of his incredulous expression. Then, he swung brutally again and again against the towering envoy, who slowly started to crumble to the floor, as more and more pieces of him turned into ashes. St. Croix never wavered until the envoy disappeared in a flash of acrid smoke. The rest of his body crumpled, collapsed on the floor in a heap of ash and embers. He stared at the smoldering remains, his grip still tight on the rod as he returned it to the forge, the metal glowing brighter as it heated once more. St. Croix allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning back to his work. Saul's hounds would come again, and when they did, they would find no fear waiting for them in the iron den, only fire and resolve. The gentle hum of conversation filled the coffee shop as Josh moved between tables, balancing a tray of steaming mugs and warm pastries. The cozy space smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, the perfect haven from the drizzle streaking the windows outside. Josh barely noticed the rain, his focus split between remembering orders and exchanging polite smiles with customers. The rhythm of his shift was comforting, almost enough to distract him from the nagging feeling of unease that had shadowed him all day. The bell above the door jingled, and Josh glanced up, expecting another couple seeking shelter from the weather. Instead, 3 men sauntered in, their heavy boots clunking against the tiled floor. Their leather jackets bore faint scars and stains, and they carried themselves with an air of danger that didn't belong in a place like this. The leader of the group, a thick-set man with a buzz cut and a jagged scar running down his cheek, surveyed the shop with a smirk. His companions followed, laughing loudly and jostling each other as they made their way to the counter. The usual murmur of the cafe faltered. Josh forced a smile, wiping his hands on his apron as the leader leaned across the counter.
Hey kid, got any real coffee or just this frou-frou crap?
We have a variety of options. Do you prefer black coffee or...
Black, and make it strong.
Coming right up.
Josh turned to prepare the order, acutely aware of the goons spreading out across the cafe, their presence suffocating the once relaxed atmosphere. One of them lit a cigarette, ignoring the bold no smoking sign by the door. The acrid smell of smoke curled through the air, mingling unpleasantly with the scent of fresh coffee.
Excuse me?
A sharp voice cut through the tension. Josh turned to see Roxy, her petite frame somehow commanding the attention of the room. She stood with her arms crossed.
You can't smoke in here,
she said, her tone as sharp as her gaze. The smoker sneered, taking another drag.
Yeah? Who's gonna stop me?
I will. Either put it out or take it outside.
Roxy shot back. She took a step closer, her boots scuffing against the tile. The scarred leader chuckled, an ugly sound that made Josh's stomach tighten.
Relax, sweetheart. We're just enjoying the ambiance.
Roxy didn't flinch.
The ambiance doesn't include ashtrays. Put it out.
With exaggerated slowness, the smoker leaned over the counter and pressed the glowing tip of his cigarette into Josh's freshly brewed coffee. The hiss of the extinguished ember was followed by a low, mocking laugh.
Oops, hehehe,
the man said, grinning as he straightened up. Josh clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the counter, but before he could say anything, Roxy stepped between him and the goons. She said with a voice dangerously calm,
"You've had your fun. Now leave."
The leader held her gaze for a long, tense moment before smirking and saying, jerking his head toward the door,
"Come on, boys. This place's coffee sucks anyway."
With that, the trio filed out, their laughter echoing in their wake. The tension in the room lingered even after the door swung shut behind them. Josh exhaled, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. Roxy turned to him, her sharp expression softening.
You okay?
Yeah, thanks,
Josh said, though his voice was tight.
No problem.
Roxy gave him a reassuring nod before retreating to her usual corner of the shop, leaving Josh to clean up the mess. He stared at the ruined cup of coffee, the dark liquid swirling with ash and smoke. The goon's presence tormented him, a sense of foreboding settling heavy in his chest. This wasn't over. The streets were quiet as Josh walked home, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. The coffee shop's warm lights had long faded behind him, replaced by the occasional street lamp casting long shadows. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, his senses alert. Something was off. It started as a feeling, a faint prickling at the base of his neck. Then he caught it, the sound of heavy boots scuffing against the pavement, too rhythmic to be random. He didn't need to look back to know who it was. The same goons from the coffee shop were following him. Josh quickened his pace, his heart pounding as he turned down an empty street. He could hear their low voices behind him, their laughter like a predator's growl. He needed to lose them. Guided by instinct, Josh took a detour through Veterans Park, a sprawling, shadowy expanse of trees and overgrown paths. It was the place where he had awoken some time ago, disoriented and human again after a night of living as a wolf. He wasn't sure why he returned to it now, but something about the isolation felt right. The park was deserted, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the faint hum of the city beyond. Josh slipped deeper into the darkness, the muffled footfalls of his pursuers drawing closer. When he finally stopped, it was in a clearing shrouded by ancient oaks. The faint light of the moon barely penetrated the canopy above, casting the scene in silvery shadows. The goons stepped into the clearing a moment later, their faces illuminated just enough for Josh to recognize their smug grins.
Lost, kid?
The leader said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Josh turned to face them, keeping his posture loose despite the tension coiling in his muscles.
Look, I don't know what you want, but I'm not interested in trouble. Just let me go home.
The leader laughed low and menacing.
Oh, it's not about what you want. See, the master thinks you've been sniffing around where you shouldn't.
Josh frowned.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Doesn't matter. We've got our orders.
Before Josh could respond, they surged forward, moving faster than any human should. One leaped over a fallen branch with unnatural grace, another's fist struck a tree trunk with enough force to splinter the bark. Josh ducked the first swing, his instincts flaring to life as he sidestepped another blow. The air around them was heavy with a strange metallic scent, like blood, but sharper, more potent.
What the hell are you?
They didn't answer, their snarls filling the air as they attacked in unison. Josh barely dodged the flurry of blows, his reflexes strained to their limits. Then something shifted inside him, a deep, primal force surging to the surface. He stopped holding back. With a low growl, Josh let the transformation take over. His muscles rippled and expanded, his hands elongating into massive claws. His clothes tore as his body reshaped itself into the hulking form of a direwolf. The goons hesitated for a moment, their confidence faltering as they took in the beast before them. Josh didn't give them time to recover. With a feral snarl, he lunged at the nearest attacker, his claws raking across the man's chest. The criminal let out a strangled cry as he stumbled back, his shirt soaked with blood. Another came at him from the side, but Josh whirled, his massive jaws snapping shut inches from the man's arm. He followed through with a swipe of his paw, sending the goon crashing into a tree. The remaining attacker tried to circle behind him, but Josh's heightened senses caught the movement. He turned in an instant, his glowing eyes locking onto his target. With a powerful leap, he brought the man down, pinning him to the ground with one massive paw. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Josh stood in the clearing, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. The goons lay scattered, groaning in pain but alive. His wolf senses were on high alert, every sound and scent magnified. One of the goons, clutching his injured side, glared up at him.
We know who you are, freak. The master is coming for you. You can't hide.
Josh growled, his teeth bared. One of the goons managed to recover, his trembling hands steadying a pistol aimed directly at Josh's head. The sound of a gun cocking caught his attention. Josh braced himself, but the shot never came. The gunman let out a choked gasp. He crumpled, lifeless, before Josh could fully process what had happened. Whoever had intervened was gone, but their presence lingered, a reminder that Josh's life was no longer the same he had known from before. He was entering uncharted territory, a world full of danger, mysteries, and violence. He shifted back into his human form, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the lifeless body. The towering facade of the Dreadford Chronicle loomed above Josh as he waited near the entrance, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. The city buzzed around him, but all he could focus on was the turmoil inside his chest. Carla appeared moments later, stepping out of the building with a smile that faltered the second she saw his face.
Josh? What's wrong? You look...
Carla, we need to talk.
Her worry deepened.
What is it? Did something happen?
Josh hesitated, glancing away. The words caught in his throat. How could he tell her the truth, that her life might be in danger simply because she was close to him? No, he couldn't do that. He wouldn't drag her into this nightmare.
It's me. I've been thinking a lot lately. About us.
he said finally, his voice strained. Carla blinked, confusion flashing across her face.
About us? Josh, what are you saying?
He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to meet her gaze.
I don't think I can do this anymore. I've been feeling overwhelmed. There's just too much going on in my life right now. I need to focus on myself. Figure things out.
Her mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no words came. She stared at him, searching his face for some hint of the truth.
Overwhelmed? Josh, why would you...
It's not fair to you.
His words rehearsed, but cracking under the weight of his emotions.
You deserve someone who can be there for you, and I can't. Not right now.
If something's wrong, you can tell me. Is there something you are not telling me?
I can't. I'm sorry, Carla. But this is something I have to do.
He said firmly, cutting her off. His heart twisted as he saw the pain in her eyes, but he pushed on. For a moment, she just stood there, her shoulders stiff, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then finally, she nodded.
If that's what you want.
She said quietly. Her voice was steady, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. Josh nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Without another word, Carla turned and walked away, her figure blending into the bustling crowd. Josh stood there for a long moment, watching her go. Every instinct screamed at him to run after her, to take it all back. But he didn't move. This wasn't about him. It was about keeping her safe. He had made his choice, and he would live with it. As he turned to leave, the faint smell of blood on the wind reminded him why he had to. The chamber was steeped in shadows, illuminated only by the flickering flames of a grand stone hearth. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, depicting scenes of blood and conquest. A mahogany desk, intricately carved with symbols long forgotten, stood at the center of the room. Behind it sat the master, an imposing figure cloaked in darkness, his piercing eyes gleaming like rubies. The battered thugs' goons stood before him, their heads bowed, their bodies trembling with the weight of their failure. Their clothes were torn, bloodied, and stained from their encounter with the direwolf.
You had one task. Find him. Bring him to me.
The leader of the group, clutching his side where deep claw marks marred his flesh, dared to look up.
We tried, Master, but he's not just some guy. He turned into a wolf, a huge one, like nothing I've ever seen.
The master tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable.
A wolf?
Yeah, big as a damn horse. He tore through us like we were nothing. I swear, Master, he's not human.
The master rose slowly from his chair, his movements fluid, predatory. The flickering firelight cast his angular features in stark relief, enhancing the deadly aura that clung to him. He moved closer, his footsteps silent against the polished floor. He was almost gliding over it. The room fell silent, the tension thick as the master's gaze swept over his bruised and bloodied subordinates. One of them opened his mouth to speak, but the creature raised a hand, silencing him.
No more excuses. You failed me.
The leader flinched, his knees threatening to buckle.
Master, we...
Enough.
The single word cut through the air like a blade. The monster turned and moved toward the large window at the far end of the room. Outside, the city of Dreadford sprawled beneath him, its lights flickering like embers rising from the fire.
Let's see what kind of beast you really are.
His fingers brushing against the edge of the ornate blade resting on a nearby wall.
Soon, you will kneel before me, wolf. And with you under the power of my blood, my station within the court will soar.
He glanced back over his shoulder, his crimson eyes glinting with malevolence.
Leave me.
The men scrambled to obey, shuffling out of the room as quickly as their injuries allowed. Left alone, the vampire turned back to the window, a cruel smile curving his lips as he picked up a dagger made of silver.
If you want something done right, you have to do it yourself.
The office was exactly what one might expect from an aging landlord, dim, cluttered, and carrying the faint scent of dust and old books. The blinds hung crooked, filtering the glow of the streetlights outside into pale slats across the worn desk. Mr. Laszlo sat behind it, counting bills with deliberate precision, his lips pursed in concentration. Josh shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. His mind was still on Carla, the breakup fresh and raw, but he had no time to dwell on it now. He slid another 20 across the desk, completing the rent payment.
That's the last of it.
Mr. Laszlo glanced up, nodded curtly, and swept the bills into an envelope.
Good, on time this month. You know, Josh, not many of my tenants are as reliable. Appreciate that.
Josh managed a weak smile, his eyes flickering to the corner of the room. A faint shimmer caught his attention, barely visible at first, a figure emerging slowly from the shadows. It was the cowboy, the same translucent, weathered man who had stared down at him in the alley. His hat was tipped low over his spectral face, and his ghostly eyes burned with urgency. Josh's breath caught, and he forced himself to look away, focusing on Mr. Laszlo.
You okay there?
Yeah, just tired, I guess.
The cowboy stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. His voice was a low rasp, carrying an unnatural echo.
It's coming, boy. Something bad's riding your way. You best be ready.
Josh didn't answer, couldn't answer. His jaw tightened as he kept his gaze locked on Mr. Laszlo, willing himself not to react. Mr. Laszlo raised an eyebrow, misinterpreting Josh's stiffness.
You seem distracted. Maybe you're burning the candle at both ends. Whatever it is, might want to talk to someone. Therapy ain't a bad thing these days, you know.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Laszlo. I gotta go.
Josh said, rising quickly. He grabbed his receipt, his movements abrupt.
Yes, sure. Take care of yourself.
The landlord replied, eyeing him curiously. Josh didn't respond, already moving toward the door. As he stepped out into the corridor, the ghost's words echoed in his mind. He looked back briefly through Mr. Laszlo's door, but the cowboy was gone. His heartbeat quickened, unease prickling at the edge of his thoughts. Something bad was coming. He could feel it now, a heaviness in the air. Pulling his jacket tighter around himself, Josh walked briskly into the night, his instincts urging him to stay moving. The street outside Josh's apartment was quiet, bathed in the pale yellow light of flickering street lamps. A shadow moved gracefully through the stillness, tall and lean, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat that swayed with every step. The figure paused at the building's entrance, tilting his head as though savoring the scent of something faint but intoxicating. Inside, Mr. Laszlo shuffled down the hallway, his slippers scuffing against the wooden floor. He'd heard the faint creak of the front door opening, a sound he knew shouldn't be there at this hour. His brow furrowed as he reached the foyer, his stout figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the old chandelier. The stranger stood there, still as a statue, his face partially obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. Something about him set Laszlo's teeth on edge, though he couldn't pinpoint why.
Can I help you?
Laszlo called out, his voice gruff but wary. The man turned slowly, revealing sharp features and piercing eyes that gleamed like polished gemstones. He smiled, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed creepy and artificial.
I was just admiring the charm of your establishment,
the stranger said, his voice smooth and with a faint trace of something ancient.
This ain't a hotel. If you're looking for someone, you better say who.
Laszlo replied, crossing his arms. The stranger stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid, almost hypnotic. Laszlo felt a chill race down his spine but held his ground.
You're a vigilant landlord. I admire that. Tell me, do you know a tenant named Joshua Mclean?
Laszlo stiffened.
I don't give out info on my tenants to just anyone.
The man's smile widened, though it remained cold. Laszlo's resistance didn't seem to bother him. Without a word, he stepped even closer, locking eyes with the landlord. Laszlo felt his thoughts swirl, his defenses slipping away. It was as if an unseen force had pried open his mind, rifling through it like pages in a book.
3rd floor, apartment 304.
Laszlo muttered, his voice dazed and mechanical. The vampire stepped back, his smile sharp enough to cut glass.
Thank you,
he said with a faint bow of his head, and in a flash a crimson cloud flew from Mr. Laszlo's neck, who blinked and collapsed to the floor before shaking off the sudden fog in his thoughts. The last thing he saw on this earth was the stranger already walking up the stairs, his presence like a shadow melting into the dimly lit hallway. Josh's apartment was modest, a mix of scattered books, worn furniture, and a faint lingering scent of coffee from his work uniform tossed over the couch. The vampire entered silently, closing the door behind him without so much as a whisper. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the details with an almost predatory focus. He moved methodically, running his gloved fingers over the surfaces of the furniture, stopping occasionally, as if sensing faint traces of energy. At the bookshelf he paused, lifting an old, dog-eared copy of Call of the Wild. He smirked.
So the wolf finds solace in stories of its kind.
He mused aloud, his voice carrying a faint edge of amusement. The vampire straightened, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. The air in the apartment was faintly charged, holding remnants of Josh's supernatural essence. A low chuckle escaped his lips as he turned toward the door.
You cannot hide from me, Joshua. The hunt begins.
He stepped into the night, his senses sharp and eager for the chase. The streets of Dreadford were slick with a recent rain, the neon lights from signs and storefronts shimmering in distorted reflections on the pavement. Josh pulled his jacket tighter against the chill as he moved through the city, his breath visible in the cold air. The ghost's warning echoed in his mind, and though he tried to push it aside, an undeniable feeling of being watched clawed at his senses. He glanced over his shoulder. The sidewalk behind him was empty, but the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Someone was there. He could feel it. Josh quickened his pace, weaving through the streets, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. He turned down an alleyway, glancing at the graffiti-covered walls as he passed. The sounds of the city grew muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the narrow passage. Then he heard it. A faint, deliberate footstep. He stopped and spun around, his heart pounding. The alley was empty. The streetlights flickered as though struggling against the encroaching darkness.
Who's there?
He called out, his voice firm but edged with unease. No answer came, only the faint whisper of the wind. Josh clenched his fists, his instincts screaming at him to move, to run. But he couldn't run blindly. He had to know who or what was following him. He began walking again, his steps purposeful now, leading his unseen pursuer deeper into the labyrinth of Dreadford's back streets. His mind raced as he tried to recall the quickest route to the warehouse district. It was an area he avoided, abandoned, derelict, and crawling with shadows, but tonight it felt like the only place he could go. The vampire moved like a phantom through the city, his presence barely disturbing the air. He could hear Josh's heartbeat, the steady rhythm tinged with anxiety. The young man's blood was unmistakable now, the faint essence of his supernatural nature mingling with the mundane aroma of sweat and rain. He smiled to himself, savoring the thrill of the hunt. This one was different, not like the familiars he commanded. There was a wildness to him, something raw and unrefined. Ahead, Josh slipped through another alley, his movements quick and purposeful. The vampire paused at the corner, tilting his head as if listening to an invisible thread connecting him to his prey. He stepped into the darkness, his footsteps silent as death. Josh reached the edge of the warehouse district, the towering, rusted structures looming like ancient sentinels. He ducked behind a stack of crates near the entrance to one of the warehouses, his breathing shallow as he tried to listen for any sound of pursuit. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. He peered around the edge of the crates and froze. A figure was approaching, its silhouette tall and poised, moving with an almost predatory grace. The man stepped into the faint light of a distant street lamp, revealing sharp, angular features and eyes that glinted unnaturally. Josh swallowed hard, his instincts flaring. Whoever this was, they weren't normal.
Joshua Mclean,
the man called out, his voice smooth and laced with dark amusement.
You've led me on quite the chase.
Josh stepped out from behind the crates, his fists clenched at his sides.
Who the hell are you, and what do you want?
The man smiled, slow and deliberate.
I am Sans-Croix, and what I want is you,
he said, his tone like silk over steel. Josh's muscles tensed, his eyes narrowing. He didn't understand the man's words, but every instinct told him he was in danger. He took a step back, scanning the area for an escape route, but Sans-Croix mirrored him, his movements unnervingly smooth.
I can smell it on you.
The stranger continued, his voice softening to a near whisper.
The wild, untamed beast. You're like nothing I've ever seen. A wolf, yes, but so much more.
Josh felt the stirrings of anger and fear intertwine, a fire building in his chest. He couldn't run anymore, not from this. If St. Croix wanted a confrontation, he'd get one, on Josh's terms.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Josh growled, his voice low.
But if you think I'm just going to roll over, you're dead wrong.
Good,
he said, bearing a hint of fangs.
I do so enjoy a fight.
Josh took a deep breath, letting the tension roll through his body. If this man wanted a wolf, he was about to get one. The vampire's eyes gleamed with predatory anticipation, his every movement a coiled promise of violence. Josh could feel his pulse quicken, the beast within stirring restlessly.
I'll give you one chance to walk away,
Josh said, his voice low but steady, though his clenched fists betrayed his rising anger. St. Croix's laugh was soft, almost pitying.
A noble offer, but unnecessary.
The vampire moved first, a blur of motion that left Josh barely enough time to dodge. The strike grazed his shoulder, the force of it sending him staggering back. Josh recovered quickly, planting his feet and bracing himself.
Big mistake.
Josh growled, his voice deepening with a guttural edge. With a roar, his body shifted, bones cracking and muscles bulging as he transformed into a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf. His limbs elongated, claws sprouting from his fingers, and his face contorted into a savage muzzle. Standing over 7 feet tall, his amber eyes burned with primal fury. St. Croix paused for a moment, his lips curling into a pleased smile.
Magnificent,
he murmured, before darting forward with preternatural speed. The two collided with earth-shaking force, Josh's claws raking through the air while his enemy twisted and dodged with fluid agility. The vampire's movements were precise and calculated, each strike aimed to exploit weaknesses in Josh's wild attacks. Josh, however, was relentless. He used his immense strength to send crates and debris flying at St. Croix, forcing the vampire to retreat momentarily. Wounds that would have incapacitated any normal creature closed almost instantly on Josh's massive frame, his regeneration fueled by a searing fury. St. Croix circled him, his gaze narrowing.
You're strong,
he admitted.
But strength without control is a double-edged sword.
He feinted left, then lunged right, delivering a rapid series of strikes that left dark slashes across Josh's chest. The werewolf howled, the pain sharpening his resolve rather than weakening it. With a bellowing roar, he leapt forward, catching St. Croix off guard and slamming him into a rusted steel beam. The vampire hissed, writhing free with supernatural speed.
Enough games,
he said coldly, reaching beneath his coat to draw a blade. The weapon gleamed under the dim light, its silver surface polished to a deadly sheen. The moment it touched the air, Josh felt a searing, unnatural heat emanating from it.
Recognize this,
the vampire taunted.
A relic from your kind's greatest weakness.
Josh lunged, but the vampire was faster. The blade slashed across his side, leaving a deep smoking wound. Josh stumbled, a pained growl escaping his throat as the silver burned like fire. His regeneration, incapable of healing the wound, the pain cutting through his fury like a knife. St. Croix pressed the advantage, his strikes precise and merciless. Each wound the blade inflicted lingered, refusing to heal. Josh was forced back, his massive frame staggering under the vampire's onslaught.
You're not invincible,
the vampire sneered.
You're just another beast pretending to be more. And when I'm done with you, I'll be paying a little visit to your redhead girlfriend. Carla, isn't it?
Josh's vision blurred with pain and rage, but something deeper stirred within him. The primal, unyielding spirit of the wolf surged, pushing past the agony. He dropped to all fours, his form hulking and feral, and with a guttural roar, he launched himself at St. Croix with uncontrollable, godless fury. The vampire's speed faltered as Josh's strength became overwhelming. Claws tore through flesh, splintering bone as Josh pinned his enemy to the ground. The vampire struggled, slashing wildly with the silver blade, but the hulking beast bit off his arm and spat it to the corner. St. Croix's confidence evaporated, replaced by a flicker of fear.
Wait! No!
He spat, his voice desperate now.
We could!
Josh's claws raked across his chest, silencing him mid-sentence. With a final earth-shaking roar, Josh drove his claws through St. Croix's heart, the vampire's body convulsing before crumbling into ash. The warehouse fell silent, save for Josh's ragged breathing. He leaned against the cold, rusted wall of the warehouse, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps, his monstrous form shrinking back into that of a battered, bloodied man. His skin was slick with sweat and blood. The silver-inflicted wounds on his torso burned with an unrelenting heat, refusing to heal. His vision blurred as the adrenaline drained away, leaving only exhaustion and pain.
Damn it,
he muttered, clutching his side. His fingers came away slick with blood from the gashes where St. Croix's blade had struck. The sound of soft footfalls reached his ears. Josh's head snapped up, his instincts sharpening despite his weakened state. A shadowy figure emerged from the gloom of the warehouse. Josh tensed, preparing for another fight. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the sharp stab of pain in his ribs.
Easy, young one,
the figure said, stepping into a shaft of moonlight. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but carried an undeniable authority. Josh's eyes widened as the figure's features became clear. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood before him, his presence as commanding as it was strange. His hair was streaked with silver, his features etched with years of experience. Most striking, though, were his eyes, golden, like Josh's when he shifted.
Carl?
Josh rasped, his voice hoarse. Carl gestured vaguely to the warehouse, the air still thick with the scent of ash and blood.
Looks like you've been busy.
Josh frowned, his confusion warring with exhaustion.
What?
Yeah, Carl said, stepping closer.
And I'd say you did pretty damn well for a first-timer. Taking down a vampire on your own? Not many pups can claim such a feat.
Josh leaned heavily against the wall, his head spinning.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask for any of this,
he said, as his head spun through the wild conversation.
What do you mean, pup? What? Did you say vampire?
Carl chuckled softly.
Yeah. Yes, I did. You've stepped into a world you don't understand yet. A world that's been hidden from you and most people.
Josh glared at him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface.
Yeah, I didn't get much of a choice. This thing, it just happened. Why are vampires trying to kill me?
Carl's expression grew serious.
You're right. You didn't choose this. But you can't run from it either. What you are, what we are, it's in our blood. It's time you learned the truth, Josh.
Carl stepped closer, his gaze steady and unyielding.
Listen, you got questions, I get that. And I'll give you answers, but first you need to understand something. What you are, what we are. It's dangerous. There are rules and enemies. The vampire you fought tonight was just the beginning.
Josh studied Carl warily, the weight of his words sinking in.
So what? You're here to recruit me into some kind of werewolf secret society?
Something like that,
Carl said with a wry smile.
But first, we need to get you patched up. Those silver wounds aren't going to heal on their own, and you've got a lot to learn if you want to survive in this world.
Josh hesitated, the lingering pain in his side a sharp reminder of how unprepared he was. Finally, he nodded.
Fine, but you better not hold back. I want the truth. All of it. Something tells me you knew this all along.
Carl extended a hand.
Deal.